For many reasons now, going to a psychiatrist, probably the most dangerous thing you can do in the Western world, other than, do something illegal.
Maybe you remember I invited you to Denmark some 25 years ago, Peter Breggin. My name is Carl.
Hi!
Yeah, that was, I think, in 89 when you traveled in Scandinavia.
Yes, I went to Norway too, and Sweden.
Yeah, you went to Sweden and Norway also, yes. You brought your son with you. But I always admired you to speak up loud about the brain disabling epidemic caused by psychiatric drugs and electroshock. And you have done incredible things all these years. What I want to ask you is, did it work? Do you think, did we influence the public? Did we influence the real world? Did things change to the better or to the worse? And what's your evaluation about the coming years? Will we succeed to end this epidemic within our lifetime or something like that?
That's a great way for me to start the second part. When I first started talking about issues like this, I conducted an international campaign to stop psychosurgery. And then I went on to take on shock treatment and the antipsychotic drugs. When I started, times were extremely different. My life was repeatedly threatened. I had bodyguards. I had the FBI come in to investigate threats. When I would go on television, I would be ambushed. I'd end up with 4 people attacking me. Audiences were very threatening. A psychiatrist was slandering and libeling me in the press. I sued one of the more big ones, Leo Alexander in Boston, and he settled for a lot of money. Then they stopped slandering me and libeling me. Times have vastly changed since then. There are many, many people, first of all, doing wonderful work. Peter, Gertrude, Robert Whitaker, many, many people, Matthew Downing. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin talking about all the people in the audience. And the attitude of the public has hugely changed. In the United States, I get standing ovations instead of having to have a bodyguard. Now, that doesn't mean the profession has changed at all. And again, I think if you look at it in terms of, say, the Soviet Union or slavery in the US, as public opinion turns against the Politburo or against the slaveholders, they get tougher. They get more slaves. They get more oppressive. So psychiatry is probably the worst I've ever seen it. The most stupid, the most ignorant, the most totally at odds with Western civilization and all that's good in humanity. Completely opposed to freedom, autonomy, love, spirituality. Psychiatry is the worst it's been. It's very much like the psychiatry that took over in Germany when Hitler came. The psychiatrists loved Hitler. There were more psychiatrists joined Hitler, percentage-wise, than any other group, and that's another story I could come back and tell you. I've lectured on that in Germany, actually. So psychiatry is worse than ever. They'll start doing a lot of lobotomies again if we don't speak up. Shock treatment's rampant. But the public is so much more aware. Everywhere I go, people thank me. Everywhere I go, people tell me horror stories. It doesn't matter whether it's a man repairing a roof of my house or if it's a waitress in a restaurant. People have gotten the idea, at least in the US, that this system isn't working. But more and more people are in the system, ironically, because psychiatry has revved up and gotten worse. The drug companies are pouring more money into advertising. So you have 2 separate camps evolving now. The people who are against this whole system, or at least very suspicious of it, and the system. And both, I think, are increasing We will never change the system. You don't make the Politburo into nice people. You don't make slaveholders into freedom lovers. You have to do something to stop them. I think the most obvious way it's going to stop is people stop going. Like the song about war, what if nobody went? But I also think we need to be very active in other ways. I'm very active in the legal system. I do a great deal of legal work that draws attention to what they're doing, that punishes them for what they're doing, but the goal is just to do honorable legal work. So that's my answer to that question. It's a kind of complicated one. I want to get a little more systematic now and cover some things about my theory about psychopharmacology. All of this is in my books. It's in my big book, the medical book, Brain Disabling Treatments in Psychiatry, with thousands of references at the end. And it's also in my latest book, summarized in the first half of Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. The most important principle to understand about psychiatric drugs is not very complicated, but I see hardly anyone except Joanna Moncrief in Great Britain, the psychiatrist, they are building on this principle. Yet it's the most fundamental principle, and that is that psychiatric drugs only can work by disabling the brain. There are no psychoactive substances that improve your marvelous brain, period. Not nicotine, not even caffeine, certainly not marijuana or street drugs, and even more than any other drugs, the psychiatric drugs, because they're tailored to get across the blood-brain barrier and do as much damage as possible. They're tailored to do that. So what does it mean when a psychiatric drug works? Well, it means it's disabled the person's brain. It might be your own brain. Let's say you have a few drinks to fall asleep at night. I don't begrudge you that as long as you know what you're doing, but you're doing it by disabling your brain. And it's no different if you take some benzos to go to sleep at night. They affect very similar neurotransmitter systems. So that's the basic, most important principle about psychopharmacology. And I hope all of you will begin to use it more when you write and think and talk. As a part of that, a corollary to that, is that no drugs improve brain function. So all the psychoactive substances disrupt it and no drugs improve it. Now, why does a disability get to be seen as an improvement? I'm going to go through the various classes of drugs and talk to you about that. But first I want to cover two other principles that will go into your understanding. One principle is what I call medication spellbinding. When I write about it in scientific articles or in my books, all my articles are on my website for free. When I write about it, I call it intoxication anosognosia, not knowing you're intoxicated. When we take a psychoactive substance, we lose our capacity to judge its effect on us. Any of you who have ever been at a party where everybody but you is smoking marijuana, you'll find that the profound statements being made are absolutely silly, and the cookies don't taste all that good. It's all the misleading effects of the drug. The person who thinks they're the life of the party on alcohol may be ruining their business and social relationships. Alcoholics commonly drive cars believing that the drug really doesn't impair them. It's the same with psychiatric drugs. I often will see a couple and let's say the husband will say, I've been doing better since I've been on antidepressants the last couple of years. And I'll notice there's a little flatness in what he's saying. Doesn't have that sparkle of the human treasure there. And maybe his wife will say, well, you know, honey, I know that you seem to feel you're better, but we haven't made love in 2 years. And you don't even play with the dog anymore. The man, meanwhile, all he knows is that he's had some relief of pain through the anesthesia. Really, it becomes apathy and indifference, often long term, from the antidepressants. But the person doesn't know it. I had a man come to me on antidepressants who I took a detailed history from. He'd only been on for 2 months. I told him that, well, one of the things we'd work on was his having a life, because he didn't have any life. He didn't go out, he didn't socialize, and so on and so forth. He'd only been on a month or two, and we just took him right off. He came back a week later and described a very active life he had. He hadn't even thought about having his active life on the drug. He couldn't even remember the friends he played cards with. Not that his memory was gone, his engagement was so gone with life, he couldn't describe the fact that he actually had quite an involved social life, even though he was single. The way the antidepressants, and I'm going to try to go drug class by drug class, the way the antidepressants affect people is kind of complicated, but one of the first things that happens is that people sometimes get a little high. I'll read a medical report and it will say, the patient came in after a week on the drug or 6 weeks on the drug and says he's never felt better. And the doctor puts exclamation points, bang, bang, bang. Well, that's a terrible sign. That's not a wonderful sign. What does it mean if you're on a drug and you've never felt better in your life? It means you're euphoric. It means you have brain injury that's giving you an unrealistic appraisal of the life that you have been leading, which has been making you miserable. It's not a good sign. The shock doctors do the same thing. The patient gets a euphoric and the doctor writes in the chart, mood improved, instead of symptoms of brain damage showing through. Now, with the antidepressants, that sometimes the euphoria will lead to mania, then you got a real problem. And more often it just goes away. And people go from one antidepressant to another, trying, without even knowing it, to try to get that brief euphoria. Then what gradually happens on the antidepressants, and I'm sure I'm addressing some people in this room, and I want to be as thoughtful about this as I can, is that without knowing it, you start to lose the edge. That spiritual connectivity. And you might just think about whether you do your artwork that you loved as much before, or your music, or if your relationship to God or Jesus, whatever your view is, was as spiritual, or whether you really had the same amount of enjoyment from your children now as you did, if you like taking walks with your dog as much as you used to. Because the eventual effect of the antidepressants, in my experience, and I think this is a fact, is it wears down connectivity, that very special highest quality. In the long run, people can't get off the antidepressants. In the US, we have an estimated 20% or more of women on antidepressants. I think it's mostly because they can't get off. And when they try to get off, they have such terrible dysphoria, pain, suffering, physical, neurological problems that they think they're mentally ill, terribly mentally ill. The doctor says, yeah, you need more of the drug. And you go back on the drug and the anesthesia returns. Now, many of you are going to be functioning really, really well on some of those antidepressants. But I believe if you carefully and thoughtfully come off, you'll discover that there's more to you than you realized. Because the generalized disruption of neurotransmitter systems does not leave us at our very, very best, with our best potential for creativity and happiness. Long term, every class of psychiatric drug, we have evidence not just for biochemical imbalances that remain. But by the way, there are no biochemical imbalances in your brain before you start taking the drugs. Then you get multiple ones, not just one, like Eli Lilly might claim for Prozac. You get multiple imbalances. But in all the groups of drugs, long-term, there is visible brain damage on MRIs for many people. Let me talk to you about the stimulants. In 1990 something or other, 98 maybe, because of one of my books, the leading office in our health agency in the US told their major conference on ADHD and its treatment that they had to have me there, because they didn't have this huge conference that was going to be the conference to talk about ADHD and its treatment, and they didn't have anybody talking about adverse drug effects. I mean, that's the way the establishment is. So I got to go there, and the guy from NIMH, he didn't want me there. This came right out of the Office of Health and Human Services, the top office that had me come in. His name was Peter Jensen. His name still is Peter Jensen. I said to Peter, I'm not just going to talk about the adverse effects of the drugs. I'm going to talk about the animal model, which tells us how the drugs work. And the greatest expert in the world, supposedly on the subject, Peter Jensen, said there is no such research. Well, there are innumerable articles on animal research. If you take a chimpanzee, and this is how we get the brain, looking at how each of these drugs disables the brain, how it shows clinically. They all ultimately are disrupting neurotransmitters. Probably because of effects quite deep in the place called the basal ganglia, as well as in the frontal lobes. If you give a chimpanzee, which is like a normal child, chimps like to play, run, jump, escape. They don't want to be in cages. They touch each other. They're very loving. They're quite social. They're high up on this evolutionary process of being very social. If you give them a classic stimulant, methylphenidate, amphetamine, methamphetamine, they lose spontaneity across the whole spectrum of their behaviors. It crushes spontaneity. So in a chimp, what you see is there's less escape behavior, there's less exploratory behavior, there's less socializing, smiling, less hugging, less kissing, and less touching, less grooming. And that behavior is replaced with robotic, obsessive-compulsive behavior, such as chewing on bars, playing with pebbles, or pacing. We are making our children into good caged animals when we give them a stimulant drug. We're crushing their spontaneity, and we're, through the basal ganglia, enforcing obsessive-compulsive disorder. There was a study done at NIH of their own elementary school there, where all the kids are on drugs. It's the only study that actually looked at OCD as an adverse effect. They found that half the children had obvious clinical OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, from the drugs. And of course, since they were, quote, doing better, they'd all lost their spontaneity too. That's the sadness of Western education. In the US, teachers always rate children improve when they lose their spontaneity on the drugs. So it's very, very clear how the drug works. In this case, it's not for the child at all. Of course, the diagnosis doesn't even include ADHD, anything like child suffering, child unhappy, child anxious, child depressed. No, it's child doing things that annoy teachers. That's how this was evolved. It's just a list of things. Talks out of turn, squirms in seat, things that annoy teachers. Well, you can flatten all that. He won't throw spitballs at little Janie anymore. Janie won't send a note to her girlfriend. This is a crime. This is not a mistake. This is a consciously developed crime. There are no studies that show that stimulant drugs help anything. All the studies show is that for a few weeks you can suppress behavior until the brain fights back. We've got the massive MTA study that was a criminal attempt to try to show the drugs worked, and they couldn't even do it. They couldn't even do it with millions of dollars invested. The drugs don't work. They don't improve any quality of the child's life. And they cause horrendous problems from permanent tics to heart disease to stunted growth to psychosis. When Adderall XR, I don't know if you have the equivalent of that, that's the amphetamine mixture that's long-acting. When it got approved in the US, and we lead the way for all of you, they studied it for 3 weeks. Our FDA approved it on a basis of a 3-week study. Why did they only go 3 weeks? Because they don't work. Don't you think they'd love a 6-month study to brag about and take the market away from everybody else? Instead, they do a 3-week study so they can avoid showing the drug doesn't even suppress behavior, but it ends up causing disturbances after a few weeks. Children universally don't like the drug, but children universally, even when they're angry and mean, want the approval of adults. So when they see that the adults like their behavior better, the children say that they want to take the drug sometimes. They'll say that. But they don't tell you that they like the drug if you interview them. Parents are simply bamboozled. This child abuse is not because of the parents, it's because of the drug companies and the prescribers and anybody else who stands by and watches. We now have studies that, and I give the sites briefly in psychiatric drug withdrawal, following the first children in America from the 1970s, boys whose teachers thought they were mildly hyperactive and whose parents thought they were fine. And they got started in a free clinic, makes it a federal crime, on Ritalin. Now, 40 years later, they have very statistically significant increases in every bad outcome you can measure. Suicide, crime, mental hospitalization, imprisonment, drug addiction, depression, suicide, and on brain scan, they have atrophy. Now, the people who do the study say this shows you that having some hyperactivity is a disaster. That's how sick they are. Now, what caused this? Not a few years of Ritalin. That can do a lot of damage, but not that kind of damage. What happened to these people is they became lifelong career mental patients, a lot of them, because the drug robbed them of their autonomy and their spontaneity, made them think they were mentally ill, made them think they needed drugs, gave them adverse effects that were then treated with more drugs. Many of these patients, unlike the controls, were so fat they couldn't even get in the scanner. That means they were on the newer antipsychotic drugs. Horrible outcomes for these children. I really hope some of you will get really active on calling for a ban. The antipsychotic drugs are very easy to understand their brain disabling effects. They cause a chemical lobotomy. All of them suppress dopamine. All of them do it fairly intensely, with the possible exception of clozaril, which is so poisonous it's been banned in many European countries before we approved it. They block a dopamine D2, which is the primary nerve trunk from deep in the brain to the basal ganglia to the frontal lobes. When somebody tells you that schizophrenics have too much dopamine because the drugs work and are blocking dopamine, they're very stupid or very psychopathic. It's a horrendous experience. Most people hate it. But remember, many people are self-hating, or they're just overwhelmed with their suffering, and they may say it's better. They don't know that there are better ways than being chemically lobotomized. The data on these drugs causing shrinkage of the brain is overwhelming. The CPN in Great Britain recently tried to get their society, that's the Critical Psychiatry Network, I'm a member of that, tried to get their whatever their society is, to have at least a seminar in their big conference on brain damage from these drugs, and they couldn't, despite the fact they have multiple psychiatrists who wanted it. The mood stabilizers, just using lithium as an example, it is so toxic that when it was used in salt shakers in the 20s, it killed people. It was discovered when a man named Cade, C-A-D-E, injected guinea pigs with the drug. He was a psychiatrist, but he was studying renal functions. He injected guinea pigs with the drug, and they became flaccid. So he thought, this is fabulous. He literally walked across the street from his lab and started giving it to mental patients in Australia. And it made everybody flaccid. Then the National Institute of Mental Health promoted it as a magic bullet. No, it's one of the most disruptive drugs there are. The other mood stabilizers, most of them are anti-seizure drugs. They're basically sedating people and suppressing brain function. That's all my colleagues know how to do, is suppress, suppress, suppress. Damage, damage, damage. Whether it's drugs, ECT, or psychosurgery, disabling the brain, destroying brain has been a part of our history. We used to openly acknowledge it. Used to be able to read in textbooks about all the damage until I started quoting it in public books. And they stopped. I've actually changed the whole way they write. Finally, the benzos, they're very easy. The benzodiazepines are anesthetics. If you give enough of them to a person, you could do major surgery on them. When you feel less anxiety on a benzo, it isn't because your anxiety has been suppressed, it's because all your higher function has been suppressed. Anxiety, as the existentialists have tried to teach us, I don't actually believe in them anymore, but they're wonderful for when you're young. My anxiety is not about my family and my fears of how to live. It's about some abstraction. It's not. It's about our social relationships. Anxiety is a very higher function, so it's one of the very first things to be flattened by the benzos. That pretty much covers the drugs. The benzos are horribly addictive. All the drugs have withdrawal reactions. Every drug, because the brain fights every drug. The brain doesn't say, whoopee, my dopamine is suppressed. It tries to get dopamine hyperactive, which produces tardive dyskinesia and severe withdrawal reactions, both psychological and emotional. The benzos is like withdrawing from alcohol. You go into the DTs. Withdrawal from the stimulants, you crash into depression. One way to think about what does a drug do on withdrawal is to think of what would the opposite of the drug effect be, because the brain's trying to do the opposite. So if the drug jacks you up like a stimulant, and like many of the antidepressants are very stimulating on some level, you may not even feel it, but they are jacking things up. So when you come off stimulants and antidepressants, the most likely thing that's going to happen to you that's very dangerous is suicidality and horrendous depression. And because of medication spellbinding, you need to tell your patients this every day. Because of medication spellbinding, they won't think, oh, I'm depressed because of the drug. They won't even think it even though you told them. They will be spellbound and think that life sucks and they should die. So you have to just keep in touch with people when they're coming off meds. They need to have a whole support network. If you can get one going with them, they need at least one person talking to them a few times a day. If you're doing serious drug withdrawal, that is people who have been on for months and months or on multiple drugs. So withdrawal, expect the opposite effect, but don't be certain, because you never know. I tell people, if you get any weird feeling, I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's an ache in your big toe and you think it's gout. You get any odd feeling during withdrawal, call me. Because it might be drug withdrawal. Because you've disrupted multiple neurotransmitter systems. You can't just block serotonin reuptake, the famous SSRI model, because when you block serotonin, other nerves start working overtime to compensate. The whole brain gradually goes out of whack. And eventually you're not even reducing serotonin in the brain because the brain's jacking up its serotonin production. So you got all these compensatory mechanisms, and they lead to serious withdrawal. There are very good studies that actually show that your odds on having a manic attack when coming off lithium are greatly increased during the withdrawal period. So you get manic withdrawal from lithium. Then the doctor says, oh, you've got bipolar disorder. But you might say, but doc, it's 20 years, you know, and I've hardly ever had a bipolar in my life. And now I start lithium and I come off it and I've got another attack 2 weeks or a week later. But, you know, patients, even when I'm a patient, I don't have the wherewithal to make these clever observations with the doctor. You tend to give up authority in the presence of the doctor. A main point about psychiatric drug withdrawal as an outpatient, that's what I'm talking about, is you go at the patient's pace, not yours. You go as slow as possible, and I describe in the book there's many ways to go as slow as possible. Most of the antidepressants, for example, come in fluid form, eyedroppers. You know why they did that? So you can give them to infants. They don't do things for good reasons. They do things for marketing reasons. Actions. I could probably stop there. Go ahead.
Oh, you could hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, because we only have 10 more minutes. I would like to ask you about two things, Peter. One of the things you write in your books, which I find incredibly important, is if you get a patient that has taken marijuana or LSD or heroin, and that patient is psychotic, then you don't say you have schizophrenia. But if you have a patient who is on a psychiatric drug that develops a psychosis, then you say, oh, now you also have a psychosis, so I need to add an antipsychotic drug. So this you have alerted people to. It should be forbidden to come up with new psychiatric diagnoses when you already get a drug, because it could be a side effect to that drug. I mean, there are people here who would like to ask you, I have asked my doctor to have this drug withdrawn, and my doctor says I should just go on. What does a patient do in that situation?
In our country, what I recommend is you get a therapist to help you with the suffering that you go through during withdrawal, and maybe a GP, a general practitioner, because your psychiatrist won't, to help you slowly withdraw from the meds, and give them my book to read. By the way, it is so common now. I just saw a patient who was, the parents decided to bring her to me instead of right into a mental hospital because she had become schizophrenic and was hallucinating. And what were her hallucinations? Well, since starting on an antidepressant, she was seeing bugs on the wall. Well, in the old days, we knew in the 1960s that if a patient was seeing little tiny things, they had an organic psychosis caused by drugs. We knew that. Everybody knew that. The DTs, you see little bugs running around. And nobody had suggested to her that this so-called psychosis or schizophrenia, which is not a term I believe, by the way, that this was causing the bugs on the wall. It's very bad out there, folks. The psychiatrists are the most ignorant people on the face of the earth now. There's 2 reasons, 3, 5, probably 10 reasons why psychiatrists are so ignorant. 1, they do horrible things to people and can't bear to look. 2, the people going into psychiatry now are not like we used to be, you know, neurotics who had some therapy and we liked it, so we became a psychiatrist. They're now withdrawn human beings who find a way in medical school that they can have power in relationships and drug and shock and lock people up. So they're not nice people, they're not empathic people. And another thing is that if you actually begin to look at people as objects, and you start saying things like you can't talk to schizophrenia, you treat people as objects, you become destructive to them. It is very hard to be, quote, objective about a human being. It tends to bring out the destructiveness in us. So for many reasons now, going to a psychiatrist, probably the most dangerous thing you can do in the Western world, other than, you know, do something illegal. And unfortunately, it's also your GP now, so it's really gotten bad. Your general practitioner, everybody's giving the drugs out.
Yeah. Questions for Peter Breggin?
I'm Julius Nissen. I don't know if you happen to know Leonard Shaw. He wrote a book called Love and Forgiveness. Very good book. It's some
Good.
of the themes you are into. I just want to tell you, we are, I think, sadly, only two Danish psychiatrists here today. We both, on a free basis, help people out of their medications. We both got expelled from the Danish psychiatry. And I would also like to tell you that we have early experience in Denmark, also in the community psychiatry, where we didn't give that many drugs simply because the patient wouldn't take them.
The wisdom I am sharing with you today is very old wisdom. I'm just applying it in a new setting. It's all pretty much what every wise person has concluded, that we need to love one another and need to heal one another. I think that's the main thing I would say in response to that.
Thank you, sir, for your insights. I'm a neuroscientist, and I would just like to ask you, the services that you provide in the US, these valuable services, speaking from the point of view of the way you finance services of this kind in the US, is this form of treatment or intervention available to everyone? And would you say in a country like Denmark, where it's the public purse that pays for these services, that there are psychiatrists enough to provide these services, assuming that they are much more time-consuming than the bad services that are provided now?
It's a lie that giving drugs is cheap. I mean, it produces vast amounts of hospitalization, disability, violence, suicide. That's number one. Number two, stop thinking psychiatrists. They're not going to be able to deliver decent services ever. They have wedded themselves to the drug companies. You have to start thinking, what alternative services do we have? What can we develop? What are the modes of training people? I'd rather you had a model like the ministers in the US. Almost anybody can get licensed as a minister and have a church. I'd rather see that model than let people go to a therapist who claims they trained with so-and-so, or go, it's not going to come through the state and through licensing. That's not what states do. It's going to have to be grassroots, people developing much more inexpensive ways of doing therapy. If we opened up to a whole variety of kinds of people doing therapy, therapy would be cheap and plentiful. In fact, in America, psychiatry is vastly declining because students don't want to go into this awful profession. They see it, and the only ones who want to go into these withdrawn, unable to relate to people who want to manipulate and control. Your ordinary doc, you didn't want to go into anything as crazy as this. So psychiatry is becoming less and less, but then the drugs are being given by more and more different kinds of doctors. Think outside this box. The answer is not inside psychiatry. Psychiatry has always been an oppressive model that's been going on since it began in the state mental hospitals. The whole history of psychiatry is rooted in the state mental hospitals. The main difference now is that what we used to just do to people in state mental hospitals, psychiatry gets to do to everybody. You got more kids on drugs in school than we used to have in our children's units.
Oh, there is someone from Danish national television. We just have one national television, so I will give him the last word.
As I understand, psychiatric drugs is a relatively new invention. As I understand it, it originates from the United States in the 1950s. Before then, you were either received lobotomy or you were castrated, but you were not perceived sick or otherwise needing treatment. So what interests me is that during the 1950s, something must have changed since we could go from being just being perceived as mad to going to be a patient and become ill.
Psychiatrists have been poisoning people for 200 years with drugs. We used to give people arsenic and any poison we could think of, we've given to patients. We've given them things to make them vomit, have diarrhea, have convulsions. So we've been poisoning people from the beginning, And if you go back to England, where they had moral therapies for a while, where Tuke, who was a Quaker, had a facility that was based on love, caring, and spirituality, and they took the most difficult patients and they helped them and they left. He even then was saying, and they were 18th century and 19th century, he was saying we have to keep the docs out because they want to poison the patients. So that's been going on forever. However, the question is very, very good. I think that the first turning point was Valium, because it provided a drug that in one dose could make you feel better, just like alcohol without the stigma. And so instead of, and it was directed at housewives and advertised to housewives, it was called Mother's Little Helper. And a lot of women were told this was not addictive like phenobarbital. It's actually more addictive than phenobarbital. And millions of women in particular got hooked on these drugs. That was the beginning. And that didn't turn out so well. The next big breakthrough was when psychiatry began to lose all of its patients to women therapists. For a long time, psychiatry had the power to say through the insurance companies, if you're going to go to a psychologist or a counselor or a social worker, you must also see us and be supervised. The insurance companies gave that up in the 60s. And then you had this burgeoning in the US of family therapists and counselors, marriage and family counselors, women who were much better at helping women, who were most of the patients, than men. It wasn't like going to the office and you saw somebody as remote as your husband and only worse. Now you could go in and talk to a woman who didn't have all the pretenses and the drugs. And so psychiatrist offices started to become empty. The American Psychiatric Association was losing membership because doctors didn't even have enough money to be members, psychiatrists. So, and I've traced this in toxic psychiatry from the minutes of the American Psychiatric Association. They literally got together and said, we have to change the whole model. All illnesses are medical. All illnesses might want drugs. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to go into partnerships with the drug companies. Well, the drug companies leaped with joy and promptly took over psychiatry and medicine. And starting in the 60s and 70s, American medicine, first mostly with psychiatry, but now all aspects, were taken over by the drug companies, and the issue became marketing. Market to adults, you run out of that. Market to children in the US, you run out of that. We'll go to Germany and Australia and England, run out of saturate them. Well, we'll go after the Danes and the Norwegians and the Swedes. All marketing. I think that's a brief history. Does that make sense to you?
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So, thank you again, Peter. We will draw to a closure now. Okay? Thank you a lot.
Thank you. I'll bleep out. Maybe I'll stay.